I want to talk today about one of America's great mysteries, Ayn Rand. So I find this really hard to think through. This is a person who was an amphetamine-addicted author of sub-Dan Brown potboilers, who in her spare time wrote lavish torrents of praise for serial killers and for the Bernie Madoff-style embezzlers of her day. She opposed democracy on the grounds that the masses, her readers, were lice and parasites who scarcely deserved to live. But, and this is the weird thing, she is still one of the most popular writers in the United States, selling 800,000 books a year from beyond the grave. She regularly tops any list of books that Americans say have most influenced them. And since the great crash of 2008, her writing has had another Benzedrine rush, as Rush Limbaugh hails her as a prophetess, and Paul Ryan, the architect of the Republicans' budget plans, said that she's the reason that he went into politics. With her assertions that government is evil and that selfishness is, quote, the only virtue, end quote, she's the patron saint of the Tea Parties and the death panel doomsters. So this is what I want to figure out. How did this little Russian bomb of pure immorality in a black wig become an American icon? There were these two biographies of Rand last year, Goddess of the Market by Jennifer Burns and Ayn Rand and the World She Made by Anne Heller, that tried to puzzle out this question, showing how her arguments found an echo in the darkest corners of American political life. But for me, when I read them, those books actually work best on a level I didn't expect. Because what they are at their heart is a thrilling psychological portrait of a horribly damaged person who deserved the one thing she spent her life raging against: compassion. Her original name was Alyssa Rosenbaum, and she was born in the icy winter of Tsarism, not long after the failed 1905 revolution ripped through her home city of St. Petersburg. Her dad was a self-made Jewish pharmacist, and her mum was an aristocratic dilettante who loathed her three daughters. She was always telling them she never wanted children, and she kept them only out of duty. So Alyssa became a kind of surly, friendless child. In elementary school, her class was asked to write an essay about why being a child was a joyous thing. Instead, she wrote, quote, a scathing denunciation of childhood. And it began with a quote from Pascal that said, "I would prefer an intelligent hell to a stupid paradise." But obviously the Rosenbaums' domestic tensions were dwarfed by the conflicts that were raging outside. The worst anti-Jewish violence since the Middle Ages was brewing, and the family was terrified of being killed by mobs the whole time. But actually it was the Bolsheviks who struck at them first. After the 1917 revolutions, her father's pharmacy was seized in the name of the people. For Alyssa, who had obviously, grown up surrounded by servants and nannies, the communists seemed to be, at last, the face of the masses, a terrifying robbing horde she'd always been afraid of. In a country where 5 million people died of starvation in just 2 years, the Rosenbaums went hungry too. Her father tried to set up another business, but it too was seized, and he declared himself to be on strike, which is going to be significant in a minute. The Rosenbaums knew that their angry, outspoken daughter would not survive under the Bolsheviks for long, so they arranged to smuggle her out to their relatives in America. Just before her 21st birthday, she said goodbye to her country and her family for the last time. She was determined to live in the America she had seen in the silent movies, the America of skyscrapers and riches and freedom. She renamed herself Ayn Rand, a name she thought had the hardness and purity of a Hollywood starlet. She headed for Hollywood, where she set out to write stories that expressed the philosophy she'd developed, a body of thought she said was the polar opposite of communism. She announced that the world was divided between a small minority of supermen who are productive and, as she put it, the naked, twisted, mindless figure of the human incompetent, who, like the Leninists, tried to feed off the productive people. He is, quote, mud to be ground underfoot, fuel to be burned, end quote. And it's evil to show kindness to these lice. The only virtue, she said, is selfishness. She meant it. Her diaries from that time, while she worked as a receptionist and as an extra, lay out the Nietzschean mentality that underpins all her later writings. The newspapers were filled for months at the time in LA with stories about a serial killer called William Hickman, who kidnapped a 12-year-old girl called Marion Parker from her junior high school, raped her and dismembered her body, which he sent mockingly to the police in pieces. Rand wrote great stretches of praise for him, saying he represented, quote, the amazing picture of a man with no regard whatsoever for all that society holds sacred, and with a consciousness all his own. A man who really stands alone in action and in soul. Other people do not exist for him, and he does not see why they should. End quote. She called him, quote, a brilliant, unusual, exceptional boy, end quote, shimmering with immense explicit egotism. Rand had only one regret. As she put it, a strong man can eventually trample society under its feet. That boy, Hickman, was not strong enough. It's not hard to see this as a kind of political post-traumatic stress disorder. Rand believed the Bolshevik lie that they represented the people, so she wanted to strike back at the people through theft and murder. In a nasty irony, she was copying their tactics without realising it. She started to write her first novel, We the Living, in 1936, and in the early drafts, her central character, who's a kind of crude and obvious proxy for Rand herself, says to a Bolshevik, I loathe your ideals, I admire your methods. If one believes one's right, one shouldn't wait to convince millions of fools. One might as well just force them. She poured these beliefs into a series of deeply weird novels. She takes all kind of flabby staples of romantic fiction and peppers them with political ravings and rapes for the audience to cheer on. All these books have the same core message. Anything that pleases the Superman's ego is good. Anything that blocks it is bad. In The Fountainhead, published in 1943, a heroic architect called Howard Rourke designs a housing project for the poor. Not out of compassion, of course, but because he wants to build something mighty and grand. When his plans are slightly altered, he literally blows up the housing project, saying the purity of his vision has been contaminated by evil government bureaucrats. He orders the jury to acquit him, saying the only good which men can do one another and the only statement of their proper relationship is hands off. For her longest novel, Atlas Shrugged, which was written in 1957, Rand returned to a moment from her childhood. Just as her dad once went on strike to protest against Bolshevism, she imagined the super-rich in America going on strike against progressive taxation, and said the United States would swiftly regress to an apocalyptic hellhole if the Donald Trumps and Ted Turners ceased their toil. The abandoned masses are variously described as savages, refuse, inanimate objects, and imitations of living beings, picking through rubbish. One of the strikers deliberately causes a train crash, and Rand makes it clear she thinks the murder victims deserved it, describing in horror how they all supported the higher taxes that made the attack necessary. Her heroes are a cocktail of extreme self-love and extreme self-pity. They insist they need no one, yet they spend all their time fuming that the masses don't bow down before their manifest superiority and worship it. As her books became mega sellers, Rand surrounded herself with a tightly policed cult of young people who believed that she'd found the one objective truth about the world. They were required to memorise her novels and slapped down as imbecilic and anti-life by Rand if they asked questions. One student said, there was a right kind of music, a right kind of art, a right kind of interior design, a right kind of dancing. There were wrong books which we should not buy. Rand had become addicted to amphetamines while writing The Fountainhead, and obviously her natural paranoia and aggression were becoming more extreme as they pumped through her veins. Anyone in her circle who disagreed with her was subjected to a show trial, and that really is the right word, in front of the whole group, in which they'd be required to repent or face expulsion. Her secretary, Barbara Weiss, said, I came to look on her as a killer of people. The workings of her cult exposed the hollowness of Rand's claim to venerate free-thinking and individualism. Her message was, think freely, as long as it leads you into total agreement with me. In the end, Rand was destroyed by her own dogmas. She fell in love with a young follower called Nathaniel Brandon and had a decades-long affair with him. He became the cult's number 2 man, and she named him as her intellectual heir, until he admitted he'd fallen in love with a 23-year-old woman. As Burns explains in her books, Rand's philosophy taught that sex was never physical. It was always inspired by a deeper recognition of shared values. a sense that the other embodied the highest human achievement. So to be sexually rejected by Brandon meant he was rejecting her ideas, her philosophy, her entire person. She screamed, "You have rejected me. You've dared to reject me, your highest value." Next time someone refuses to have sex with you, I really recommend using that line, by the way. She never really recovered. We all become weak at some point in our lives. So a thinker who despises weakness will end up despising herself. In her 70s, Rand found herself dying of lung cancer after insisting that her followers smoke because it symbolised man's victory over fire. And the studies showing it caused lung cancer were, she said, just communist propaganda. By then, she'd driven almost everyone away. In 1982, she died alone in her apartment in New York City, with only a hired nurse at her side. If her philosophy is right, if the only human relationships worth having are based on the exchange of dollars, this is a happy and victorious death. Do you think even she believed that in the end? Rand was broken by the Bolsheviks as a girl, and she never left their bootprint behind. She believed her philosophy was Bolshevism's opposite, when in reality it was its twin. Both she and the Soviets insisted that a small revolutionary elite in possession of absolute rationality must seize power and impose its vision on a malleable, imbecilic mass. The only difference was that Lenin thought the parasites to be stomped on were the rich, while Rand thought they were the poor. I don't find it hard to understand why this happened to Rand. I feel sympathy for her, even as I know she would have spat it back in my face. What I do find hard to get my head round is that there are people, large numbers of people, who see her writing not as psychopathy but as philosophy and urge us to follow her. These are some of the most important figures on the American right. These are some of the people who caused the crash. Alan Greenspan was, was one of her disciples. Alan Greenspan, who was the chair of the Federal Reserve all through the boom years, in charge of a lot of the deregulation. He invited Ayn Rand to be there in the Oval Office when he was sworn in the 70s. He was her disciple right into he was older than I am now. What is it in American culture that Ayn Rand was drilling into? Unfortunately, neither of these equally kind of thorough and readable biographies offer much of an answer to this, which was, in my mind, the only great question about her. I think it might be that Rand expresses with a certain kind of pithy crudeness an instinct that courses through all of us sometimes, which is, I'm the only one that matters, I'm not going to care about any of you anymore. But she then absolutizes this in a kind of amphetamine, benzodrine-charged reductio ad absurdum, by insisting that that feeling, which is a natural human feeling, is the only feeling worth entertaining ever. This urge exists everywhere, but why is it supercharged on the American right, where Rand is regarded as something more than a bizarre joke? In a country where almost everyone believes, wrongly on the whole, that they are self-made, perhaps it's easier to have contempt for people who didn't make much of themselves. And Rand taps into something deeper still. The founding myth of America is that the nation was built out of nothing, using only reason and willpower. Rand applies this myth to the individual American, him or herself. You made yourself. You need nobody and nothing except your reason to rise and dominate. You can be America in one body, in one mind. She said the United States should be, as she put it, a democracy of superiors only, with superiority defined by being rich. Well, we got it. As the healthcare crisis has shown, today the rich have the real power. The vote that matters is expressed with a checkbook and a lobbyist. Americans get to vote only for the candidates that have been pre-funded by the super rich, by the 1%, and they receive the legislation that they have approved. It's useful, if daunting, to know that there's a substantial slice of the American public who believe this isn't a problem to be put right, but a morally admirable situation. We all live every day with the victory of this fifth-rate nature of the mini-malls. You can see how Alan Greenspan carried this philosophy into the 1990s. Why should the Superman of Wall Street be regulated to protect the lice of Main Street? The figure Ayn Rand most resembles in American life, I think, is L. Ron Hubbard, another kind of crazed, pitiable charlatan who used trashy potboilers to whip up a cult. Unfortunately, Rand's cult isn't confined to Tom Cruise and a rash of Hollywood dimwits. No, her cult and its ideas and its impulses have, by drilling into the basest human instincts, captured one of America's major political parties.